51-year-old Chawi Borders lived in Waddell, Arizona, just northwest of Phoenix. She was a Thai Buddhist who had married an American Air Force serviceman, and when she moved to the area in 1976, she started attending the Wat Promkunaram Temple. On the morning of Saturday, August 10, 1991, she and a friend, Premchit Hash, went to the temple to cook lunch for the monks. They planned on making rice and vegetables for the monks they expected to be there that day. The women attempted to enter through the front door, but it was locked. Premchit went around the back of the building and entered through a door near the kitchen. She set her grocery bags down in the kitchen and went to unlock the front doors for Chawi. As the women went back out to get more supplies from the car, they saw the monks lying on the floor silent. Assuming they were praying, Chawi and Premchit continued preparing lunch, and just before the meal was ready, the phone rang. Chawi tried to answer the phone by the kitchen and immediately noticed that the cord between the phone and the receiver had been cut. That's when she looked into the room where the monks were laying and realized something was wrong. There were 9 people laying in a circle, but one of them was the temple's only resident nun. It was forbidden for the monks and nun to lie together, so Chawi approached the group for a closer look. That's when she saw the pools of blood. Chawi returned to the kitchen and told Premchit that they needed to get help. Not stopping to put their shoes back on, they ran barefoot to the car and went to a nearby house. By the time Joe Ledwig opened his front door, the 2 women were hysterical and he couldn't really understand what was going on. He gathered that there was an emergency at the temple, so he jumped into his white Ford pickup truck and went to the place of worship to investigate. Once inside, he saw what would later be described as a mass execution. He raced back to his house and told his wife to call 911. Then he, Chawi, and Premchit returned to the temple to wait for the authorities. When police arrived on the scene, they would come face to face with the aftermath of the deadliest mass shooting in Arizona history. At 11:09 a.m., the 911 operator took the call from Joe's wife, who said there was an emergency at the temple. Then Chawi took the phone and told the operator that everyone in the temple was dead. Waddell didn't have its own police force and relied on either the county sheriff or police departments from neighboring cities. Maricopa County Sheriff's Deputy Don Whiprecht pulled into the temple's parking lot at 11:21, just 12 minutes after the 911 call. Backup deputies arrived 2 minutes later, and the 3 deputies entered the building to search the scene. Inside, there was a large room with a high cantilevered ceiling. At one end of the room, there was an alcove with a life-sized golden statue of Buddha. Inside the room, there was also a money tree with dollar bills hanging from the branches like leaves. From the main room, there was a doorway to a sitting room where the deputies found 9 bodies laying on the floor with blood pooled all around them. They were all face down, and they formed an oval around the room with their heads pointing inward. They all had bullet wounds in the back of their heads. The victims were discovered to be Paresh Kanthong, who had been the abbot of the temple since 1982, and his closest colleague, Surachai Anataro. Boonshui Chayarak was a monk who had transferred to the temple from the Netherlands a few years prior, and 3 other monks, Chalerm Chantapim, Sayang Jingayo, and Somsak Sofa. The nun was Foyser Pansapert, and her 17-year-old grandson, Matthew Miller, was a novice monk who had been at the temple that morning. The last victim was a visitor who had arrived in Arizona from Thailand about 6 weeks prior named Chirasak Chirapong. After confirming all of the victims were deceased, deputies cleared the rest of the building. The sleeping quarters had been ransacked, but the rest of the building was devoid of more victims. Authorities on the scene said the victims likely drew themselves into a state of peace once they were attacked, putting themselves into a state of calm meditation in their final moments as prescribed by Buddhist doctrine. A search of the crime scene found evidence of at least 2 perpetrators, and ballistics revealed the use of 2 weapons. One was a .22 caliber Marlin rifle and the other was a 20-gauge shotgun. Evidence showed that the assailants had sprayed a fire extinguisher into the sleeping quarters and had carved the word "Bloods" into a wall. It made investigators believe they were dealing with young offenders. They estimated that the attackers entered the temple between 10 o'clock and midnight, gathered the occupants into the sitting room, and one guarded them while the other searched for loot. Of course, most people wondered why the assailants would pick a Buddhist temple to attack. It's quite common for an attack on a place of worship to be politically motivated. Someone who is against that specific religion is trying to make a statement or trying to punish members of that community for some perceived slight against them. But it seems like Buddhist monks are pretty far down on the list of religions that have detractors. The only reason authorities could assume the temple was targeted was specifically for robbery. I don't think that Buddhists are known for having a ton of material possessions, but it's still a religious organization that does get donations on a regular basis. Thai Buddhists are known for having what's called a money tree, where people stick dollar bills to it as a means of donating money to the temple, but that wasn't touched. It just seems like an odd place to rob, and unfortunately 9 people were killed for what would end up being less than $3,000 and a handful of inexpensive electronics. There was a safe in the temple, but it had not been opened. It was likely that the monks stayed silent while the killers were there, choosing to remain in a state of peaceful meditation. After stealing what they could, one of them walked around the oval, shooting each victim in the back of the head with a .22 caliber rifle. Every victim had 2 bullet wounds in their head, with the exception of one, who had 3 bullet wounds. Several were also shot with the shotgun, presumably by the other assailant. The shotgun had been loaded with birdshot, and it seemed that whoever was wielding that weapon didn't realize how ineffective that type of ammunition was at killing a human being. Of the victims who had been hit with the birdshot, none of the wounds were fatal. Investigators found 17 .22 caliber shell casings and 3 shotgun shells at the scene. There were also cigarette butts from 2 different brands found at the scene, which reinforced the idea that there was more than one attacker. It was very unlikely that any of the monks smoked. A task force was put together to track down the killers, led by Captain Jerry White of the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office. The team set up a tip line and conducted hundreds of interviews in the first month after the murders. They cross-referenced thousands of latent fingerprints, and FBI profilers began studying the crime to narrow down the suspect pool. After a month of intense investigations, the task force was no closer to finding the killers. They had more than 500 tips that they categorized as quote-unquote real leads. But it was actually tip number 511 that helped the investigation start moving towards a conclusion. Or so the investigators thought. On September 10, 1991, a call came in on the tip line from a man identifying himself only as John. He claimed to have overheard a person named Kelsey Lawrence talking about the murders and that Kelsey owned a larger off-road vehicle. The news had reported that someone had been seen driving a Ford Bronco or Chevy Blazer near the temple around the time of the murders. John went on to tell an officer that the Bronco or Blazer was stolen and that Kelsey and some friends had traveled from Tucson to a party in Phoenix. After getting wasted, they ended up doing something stupid. John first said that Kelsey was at the Tucson Psychiatric Institute because he had attempted to commit suicide, but later he said he had been having a hard time dealing with the murder and checked himself into the institute in order to get his head straight with God. John gave erratic descriptions of Kelsey, one time blurting out that he carries a gun. When the officers asked if he would come into the task force command center, John said he couldn't because he had a drug buy going on. Despite the caller seemingly being the definition of a sketchy witness, authorities were so excited to have a name that they dropped everything else and headed to the psychiatric center. At 7:35 p.m., a detective entered the facility and asked to speak with Kelsey Lawrence. They went into a conference room, and when they asked the man if he was involved in the temple shooting, he denied it. When they asked him if he knew John, the patient danced around the question, saying he knew multiple people named John. When they asked if he had gone to Phoenix on August 9th, the man said that he had. Then he confessed to having waited in a Bronco while his friends went into the temple. After about 45 minutes, they all came running out, and he said that he was afraid that they had done something bad. Then they asked him details about the temple, which he seemed to be able to give accurately. When they asked him about the weapons, though, his answer didn't match. He claimed that the group had taken 3 guns into the temple, a 12-gauge shotgun and 2 handguns, with at least one being a 9mm. He said that he had a .380 auto, but it stayed with him in the Bronco. When the detectives asked about a rifle, Kelsey suddenly remembered seeing a rifle in the vehicle, but he said it was either a .30-06 or a .30-30. The detectives took the suspect into custody and transported him to the task force headquarters in Phoenix. That would be the start of the task force charging full speed at a group of suspects that was laid out for them by Kelsey Lawrence. Unfortunately for the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office, they would find out the hard way that Kelsey had nothing to do with the murders. As a matter of fact, Kelsey Lawrence didn't really exist. This is Monsters. Michael Lawrence McGrath was known in the Tucson area as Crazy Mike, and his friends and family would later explain that he was a compulsive liar. He was born on March 4, 1967, but sometimes gave the date June 1, 1954. Mike himself would admit that he lied a lot as a kid, but insisted that he wasn't lying during his involvement in this case. Investigators were so eager to solve the case that they became tunnel-visioned and didn't really confirm his details, most importantly, his identity. They would eventually learn that Mike had made the call to the tip line from the psychiatric facility himself, but it would be a little too late. They also didn't put together the fact that all of the descriptions of the temple that Mike had given them, the ones that made it seem like he had been there, were all details that had been in the media. Detectives would claim that Mike had told them about the word bloods being scratched into the wall, something that was not in the media, but that statement doesn't appear in the transcripts of the recorded interview at the psychiatric facility. The details of how that statement happened also differed between the 2 detectives that conducted the interview. It would be the first in a string of questionable actions taken by authorities in order to secure a check in the win column. Back at the headquarters, 7 detectives took turns interrogating Mike over the course of 3 days. All of the questioning was recorded, and listening back to the tapes is embarrassing to the sheriff's department. During those 3 days, all of the detectives systematically fed Mike information to fill in the gaps in his story. According to Crazy Mike, on August 7, 1991, he had been laid off from his employer, the McCullough Corporation, where he worked in their chainsaw manufacturing plant in Tucson. He said he had gone fishing during the day on the 9th, and then he and some friends decided to go to a party in Phoenix. That matched what he had said back at the Tucson Psychiatric Institute, but that was where the similarities ended. Every other element of his trip to Phoenix that day changed. The amount of people who went, their ethnicities, where they sat in the vehicle, and of course, the types of firearms they had with them. Other fine details he said he was too drunk to remember. He maintained that he had stayed outside of the temple and said that he had heard 3 gunshots. A bang bang, then a third bang. Shortly after that, everybody came running out of the temple. From the crime scene, Mike claimed they went to a house near Westmoreland Street, which is a road in Phoenix. There, some of the group took a black canvas bag into the house, and one of the group told Mike to go wash the Bronco. After that, Mike said they went to California, but there's no consistent story about that. The various accounts of going to California involve only 1 car, and some involve 2 cars, involving anywhere from 3 to 6 people and having been gone from 1 to 3 days. It was almost an entire day of interrogation before the authorities did a background check and realized there was no Kelsey Lawrence in the system. No criminal record, no driver's license, no social security number. At no point during the first interview, being taken to the headquarters and questioned again, did anybody ask the suspect for ID. It was then that detectives began the process of trying to find out who they were actually talking to. He danced around the question of his identity before finally giving them the name Michael Lawrence. He went on to give them the names of his parents and 2 sisters, but that information would later prove to be lies. There was the usual back and forth with detectives asking him who was involved and Mike claiming to be afraid to talk, but eventually he broke down and gave them 7 names: Pete Sherfield, Marcus Nunez, Victor Zarata, Robert and Tony Torres, Leo Bruce, and a guy named Craig. After that, being pressed for details about exactly what happened inside the temple, Mike started throwing out anything he could think of, except nothing matched the scene. Despite being adamant that he had not left the vehicle, he claimed one of the men smoked crack inside the temple and that another had shot a little girl. He claimed that Peter was a member of the Crips and everyone else, besides himself, were Bloods, but had no explanation of why they would be hanging out together. During his interrogation, he also eventually admitted that he was the John who called the tip line, though he would later tell the media that the caller was a jealous ex of his rich girlfriend. The authorities hit another roadblock when all of the contact details Mike had given them turned out to be fake. Shocking, right? The manager at the address he had given them had never heard of him, and the phone number was disconnected. The detectives had started interrogating him without knowing his actual identity, and then when he supposedly gave them his real name, they continued questioning him without verifying that ID. Mike finally relented and told them his name was Michael Lawrence McGraw, which was finally the truth. He did have an interesting story as to why he used an alias, though. He told the detectives that he had worked as a confidential informant helping to take down a gang of car thieves. He had used his real name with them and it had gotten leaked throughout the prison system, so he was seen as a narc. Sure. The first person authorities picked up was Pete Sherfield, who, by Mike's account, was the ringleader of the attack. Pete agreed to talk to detectives and said he had not been in Phoenix the night of the murders. He told them that he had a relative named Dante Parker who he believed had stole his ID. Dante owned a .22 caliber handgun, had a temper, and a criminal record. The only problem was that the last time he had been in Phoenix that Pete remembered was back in May. Obviously, we've established that the investigators here were overeager to close the case, so they marked Pete off their suspect list and put Dante in his place. It's unknown why they so easily believed Pete's claims, as they would not be so easy on the other suspects. 19-year-old Marcus Nunez, who went by Marky, was alone at home when the Tucson SWAT team burst into his house. Marky was described as a quiet, mild-mannered individual who was a pre-med student at Pima Community College. He was actually Mike McGraw's cousin. He was brought to the task force headquarters at 8 p.m. on September 11th and put into a room they called the prop room. It was set up with a layout of the temple, details about the victims, and information about the weapons. Not the weapons that were believed to have been used in the case, the weapons that Mike had described in his story. On the walls were openly displayed details of the case that investigators would later claim only the murderer could have known. Of course, unless they had sat in that room for a few hours. The room served 2 purposes. The first was to make the suspects believe the authorities had evidence tying them to the crime, and the second was to give them details of the case in order to fill in any holes in their memory. Basically, it was a room set up to get a confession. Unfortunately, after authorities told the suspects they would be executed unless they confessed and took a deal, it was more than enough to make even an innocent person admit their guilt. A detective named Pat Riley would go on to claim that Marky had only been in the room for 1.5 minutes before giving those incriminating details, but evidence revealed that he had actually been in the room for 45 minutes, and then it's not like he immediately confessed. I mean, he was actually innocent, so why would he immediately claim to have been involved in the murder? No, it wasn't until hours of interrogation that Marky started to change his tune. He told the detectives that he liked to party on the weekends, regularly drinking a lot, and that he couldn't remember what he had done. He continued to deny his involvement for a while, but he started to ease into the idea that he could have been drunk and didn't remember being there. That was the crack the investigators needed to bully Marky into a confession. 28-year-old Leo Valdez Bruce worked 2 jobs to make ends meet. He had worked for the custom shutter shop assembling and installing window shutters for 2 years and had never missed a day. In the evenings, he worked at the Tucson Greyhound Park where people gambled on racing dogs. On September 11th, he worked both jobs from 8 a.m. to 11 p.m., and as soon as he returned to his apartment, he was arrested and driven to the headquarters in Phoenix. The first problem with his arrest was that he actually lived in Pima County, not Maricopa County, meaning he was legally required to have been taken to a magistrate in Pima County before being transferred to the neighboring county. Again, having established that this task force was more concerned with closing the case than investigating it properly, the investigators ignored that and threw Leo into an interrogation. It was possibly because he would have to wait until the morning to go to court in Pima County, meaning he would be able to get some sleep. Taking him directly to an interrogation meant he was already exhausted from a long day working 2 jobs. Leo told the detectives that he had known Mike McGraw but hadn't seen him in 5 years. He told them he knew a man named Victor Zarata and that he owned a .22 caliber rifle, though Mike had never said anything about a .22 caliber rifle in his version of events. The detectives spent hours bombarding Leo with accusations, but he continued to deny any involvement. He was said to be incredibly patient, allowing the investigators to go on long-winded speeches about how they knew he was guilty before just saying, quote, "I wasn't there." When Leo learned that the shotgun injuries hadn't been fatal, he asked what would happen to him if he was the shotgun shooter, thinking it may be his best option out of the situation. That option never materialized, though, and Leo went on to describe being picked up by Marky in a Bronco and them, with a group of other guys, some in a Blazer, drove to the temple. In his version of events, Mike McGraw did go into the temple and he had been the one that waited outside. He claimed to have heard about 15 gunshots and a handful of shotgun blasts. After that, the detectives said that they were told that he was the shooter, and Leo said it was true. 21-year-old Dante Parker was up early on the morning of September 12th. He was in trade school learning the heating and air conditioning trade, and he had a test that day. Before he left, his mother gave him a telephone message from the Tucson Police Department. He called them back and agreed to answer their questions. As far as he knew, he would answer a few questions and then head to school, but he vastly underestimated what was about to happen. He was driven to Phoenix, where he was the 3rd innocent person to be aggressively interrogated at the headquarters. Detectives worked in shifts to interrogate him for a full 16 hours without a break. Even after giving an alibi that he was with his girlfriend and her roommate all weekend, the detectives hammered him with accusations. They used the tried and true method of threatening that the other suspects would talk first and paint him as the worst of them, and that would get him the death penalty when he was convicted. They had absolutely no evidence that linked any of the suspects to the murders, but they lied continually and made up evidence that sounded like it would be easy to get a conviction. Dante eventually believed he had only 2 options: a conviction and a death sentence, or a confession and a plea deal. Like the other suspects, Dante eventually broke down and confessed to being involved in the murders. 28-year-old Victor Zarata was another suspect who returned a call from the police and agreed to answer some questions. Victor also worked at the Tucson Greyhound Park, and besides having 3 other children, he was expecting his first child with his current girlfriend. Like Dante, he hadn't done anything wrong, so he assumed the questioning would be fairly benign. When an officer arrived to pick him up, he was surprised to be placed under arrest and driven into Phoenix. Then he sat in a room and waited to be interrogated for 12 hours. Victor also had a verifiable alibi, having always worked weekends. He even had pay stubs that backed that up. Investigators didn't care. They had decided that he was guilty. That's why Detective Riley eventually lied and said his boss told them that he hadn't worked the night of the murders, which is completely confounding. If you need to knowingly lie about that, then you either know his alibi was confirmed or you at least know it's possible. Why pursue someone who has a very solid alibi? It's going to get presented in court and reveal your lie. This type of investigative tunnel vision never makes sense to me. Not only are you putting an innocent person through this, but you're allowing a mass murderer to stay free. Then the detective doubled down and told Victor that his girlfriend also denied his alibi and went into a story about her on the stand, holding their baby, testifying against him. It was completely ridiculous, but in the end none of their tactics worked. No matter what they said, he wouldn't break. With no hope of a confession, they threw him in jail, and when they actually looked into his alibi, they found him on camera at work at the dog track on the night of the murder. Victor was the only one to be falsely accused and not to be charged with the murder. It would seem like, adding the fact that one of Mike's supposed accomplices had a solid alibi to all of the holes in his story, authorities would start to have doubts about his reliability. Unfortunately, the tunnel vision was too strong and they plowed ahead, doing everything they could to extract confessions from the rest of the suspects. After the team had secured the 3 confessions from Dante Parker, Marky Nunez, and Leo Bruce, they charged them, along with Mike McGraw, with 9 counts of premeditated murder. That group of young men would go on to be known as the Tucson Four, and none of them had anything to do with the crime. It was all based on the word of a single man with mental health issues who had a reputation for being a compulsive liar. But that wasn't the worst part of this story. The worst part comes when you find out that the task force had the murder weapons sitting in their headquarters the entire time they were railroading a group of innocent people into confessing to a crime they didn't commit. There were multiple tips logged every day of the investigation. Tip number 511, the call from Crazy Mike, was logged on September 10th and in the excitement of an actual named suspect. The previous tip, tip number 510, was completely ignored. That tip was from the Office of Special Investigations at Luke Air Force Base, right by Waddell. Authorities in the area knew that the task force was looking for a .22 caliber Marlin rifle, and they reported stopping a vehicle being driven by 2 teenagers, and there had been a .22 caliber Marlin rifle in the trunk. The vehicle had been driven by Rolando Caratachea, and when the detective approached him at his employer, he said the rifle was at his house. He explained that it had been borrowed by a friend and returned dirty, but when asked what the friend's name was, he claimed he didn't remember. The detective retrieved the rifle and took it back to the headquarters with the intention of sending it to the crime lab for ballistics tests. When he got to the office, tip number 511 had just come in and everyone was buzzing with excitement. The rifle was placed in one of the offices, behind a door, and pretty much forgotten. Almost immediately after their confessions, the suspects began recanting their statements. Marky told a detective that he had lied the next day, and it was followed by an aggressive campaign by his mother to defend his innocence. She provided her son with an alibi for the night of the murders, and several other witnesses backed it up. Marky owned a .22 caliber Marlin rifle, which authorities were eager to use against him, but once the ballistics came back, they proved that the weapon had not been used in the murders. Next to back out was Leo the same day. As soon as he was approached by detectives, he said he had never gone out with Marky that evening. He also had an alibi, having been at a friend's house with multiple witnesses who, when questioned, confirmed his story. Dante went back to claiming his innocence, but unlike the others, he did not have a verifiable alibi. Part of the proof he was involved was the statement from the other suspects, so their retractions helped a little. Mike would insist that he was innocent, but that was basically Mike just being Mike. He had completely made up the story about being involved with the crime, and now he was telling the media that the authorities had railroaded him and he was innocent. It would all lead to the revelation that he had started the entire process just to get attention, and the investigators bought it hook, line, and sinker. Investigators would also learn that Mike had not been laid off from his job and was actually at work on August 9th and had not been in Phoenix at any time that day. When detectives first drove him to the task force headquarters after picking him up at the psychiatric facility, Mike pointed out the house that they had supposedly gone to after the murders. Authorities got a search warrant for the house and interrogated the homeowner, neither of which had any connection to the crime. All the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office would get out of the ordeal was a lawsuit from the homeowner. After their case began falling apart, it took almost another month before someone finally remembered the rifle that had been picked up, and it was sent to the crime lab on October 21st. There, it was confirmed to be the murder weapon, and 2 months after the murders, investigators were finally on track to catch the actual killers. The gun belonged to 17-year-old Rolando Caratachea, who went by Rolly, and the police report on the traffic stop said that he had been with a 16-year-old friend named Johnathan Doody. I know. Look, I'm all for people being proud of their heritage and wanting to carry on their legacy, but if there's one last name you really should think about changing, it has to be Doody. It wasn't even his father's name, it was his stepfather's name that he had taken, so somebody had chosen that he was going to be a Doody. Worse yet was that his stepfather was in the military. That's right, his stepfather was Sergeant Doody. And when he signed up for the Air Force, he didn't seem to have any issue becoming Airman Doody, and so here we are. So I'm just going to power through it. Detective Rick Sensabaugh had been the investigator assigned to pick up the rifle on September 20th, and he had talked to Rolly and Johnathan that day. He learned that both of them had a connection to the temple, and they had both mentioned a third person named Alessandro Garcia, who went by Alex. Despite the matching weapon and the connection to the temple, he did not think it was important enough after hearing about Tip 511. Even after all the evidence pointed away from the Tucson 4, detectives stubbornly continued to try and connect them to the case. They brought Jonathan's brother, David, in because he had lived at the temple the summer before the murders. They asked him to look at a bunch of items collected from the suspects and tell them if he had seen anything in the temple, but he couldn't identify anything. When Rolly was brought in for questioning, the interrogation methods hadn't changed. Detectives pushed him hard, and Rolly eventually told them that Johnathan and Alex had borrowed his rifle, but he swore he had no idea what they used it for. He said they had it for 2 days around August 9th and 10th, and when they returned it, it was dirty and the butt was scratched up. He told the investigators that he wasn't involved in the murders, but he was unfortunately dealing with detectives who weren't just going to take him at his word. Johnathan Doody was born on May 9, 1974, and his family was of Thai descent. His mother was involved at the temple, and his brother David had apprenticed there for the summer. His stepfather was in the Air Force, which is what brought him to the Waddell area. But around the time of the murders, his stepfather was restationed in Colorado, and his family had moved. Johnathan stayed behind, claiming he wanted to finish high school in Arizona. After his family moved, he began living with his friend 16-year-old Alex Garcia. In June of 1991, Johnathan and Alex began planning to rob the temple. David told them that the monks kept cash on them and that there were a number of valuable items around. He said that there was a solid gold Buddha at the temple that was worth $2,000. After visiting the temple and seeing the money tree, they became obsessed with the idea of robbing the monks. It was likely they saw them as easy targets who wouldn't offer any resistance due to their peaceful nature. The teens purchased military clothing, including camouflage hats and scarves, goggles, and knives. Johnathan borrowed Rolly's rifle, and Alex snuck his uncle's shotgun out of the house. They went out to the desert and tested some homemade silencers they had made, but they didn't work. They still went through with their plan, and on August 9th, they arrived at the temple a little after 10 p.m. and just scoped out the building. Then they returned about 15 minutes later, barged into the temple, and ordered everyone into the sitting room. They spent about an hour in the facility, taking turns watching the monks while the others searched for valuables. They did not know the nun was in the building because she slept in a room near the kitchen, so when she walked into the sitting room they were startled, but they ordered her to her knees like the men. They used 2 military-style duffel bags to take $2,650 in paper currency, $140 in coins, 2 stereos, 6 cheap cameras, 1 cheap camcorder, a pair of binoculars, and a bullhorn. They had planned ahead of time to leave no witnesses, so Johnathan went around the room executing all of the members of the temple. Alex fired the shotgun multiple times, wounding some of the victims, but it's unclear when he fired those shots. Alex used a knife to carve the word Bloods into a wall, and they sprayed the rooms with a fire extinguisher. Then they fled in Jonathan's 1983 Ford Mustang. When Johnathan and Alex were brought in for questioning, it didn't take them long to confess to the crime, but they ended up pointing the finger at each other. They also both claimed that Rolly was with them at the temple, but Rolly continued to deny any involvement. Johnathan and Alex spent hours changing their story, though. When Johnathan was asked if any of the Tucson 4 were involved, he said no. Then at one point he claimed that there were 7 other people involved in the crime, one of them being Rowley. As time went on, Johnathan upgraded his friend's role in the crime to mastermind. According to Johnathan, Rowley had planned it all. Sadly, for much of Jonathan's interrogations, the detective tried to get the teen to admit the Tucson 4 were involved, something Johnathan refused to say. Alex eventually asked for a lawyer, but after talking with his father, he agreed to come clean about everything. When his interrogation resumed, he explained that Johnathan had come up with the idea to rob the temple after finding out from his brother that they had money there and there were no alarms. They initially planned to just rob the temple, hiding their identities, but Johnathan eventually said they had to leave no witnesses. He said that it was only himself and Johnathan that went to the temple and carried out the crime. Nobody else was involved. Not the Tucson 4, not Rowley, not anybody else. He said he had carved the word Bloods into the wall, claiming he thought it would throw a wrench in the investigation. He claimed to have fired the shotgun 4 times and didn't think his shots would have killed anybody, making sure to reiterate that it was Johnathan that did all of the killing. Of course, Alex wanted to paint himself as not having been a murderer, but it would later come to light that the temple shooting was not the last murder he was involved with. Alex was dating a 14-year-old girl named Michelle Hoover. In October, 2 months after the temple shooting, Alex decided that his girlfriend needed to prove her love to him. The way she could do that was help him commit a murder. They had spotted 51-year-old Alice Cameron at the Mesquite campground, and Alex talked to Michelle into shooting her to death. Then they stole $20 from her. The sad part of that crime is it also had an innocent person sitting in jail after being coerced into a false confession. 47-year-old George Peterson, who suffered from mental illness, had been interrogated for 16 straight hours until he confessed to the murder. After learning the murder was committed by Alex and Michelle, authorities released George, who had been locked up for 14 months awaiting trial, where the prosecutor was seeking the death penalty. The revelation of another coerced confession didn't help the already heavily tarnished reputation of Phoenix area law enforcement. After Alex's confession in the temple shooting, Johnathan still claimed other people had been involved, but he did admit that Rowley had not been there. Still, no connection to anyone else could be found, and investigators eventually came to believe that Alex's version of events was the truth. After searching Alex's house, they found the shotgun, clothing that had been worn during the attack, and items that had been stolen from the temple. That began the process of the authorities in Phoenix releasing the Tucson 4 and starting the long process of cleaning up their mess. Word had already gotten out about the severely flawed investigation, as not only the suspects' families were speaking out, but the situation had garnered the attention of the American Civil Liberties Union of Arizona. On October 31st, the Arizona Republic ran a front-page story calling the investigation a, quote, hodgepodge of conflicting witness stories and mystery suspects. Even then, the sheriff's department were still trying to link the Tucson 4 to the case, but the county attorney said they had until November 23rd to produce solid evidence they were involved, or else he would order their release. Despite wasting thousands of dollars of taxpayers' money trying to find a link between the Tucson 4 and the 2 actual killers, the task force was unable to do so, and on November 22nd, Mike McGraw, Marky Nunez, and Leo Bruce were released from prison. Dante Parker was held due to a parole violation, but the charges against them were dismissed without prejudice, meaning the authorities could charge them with the crime again if new evidence came to light, but that would never happen. After being released, Mike's stories would continue to change. He went on to tell a reporter that he had a rich, successful girlfriend, and it was a jealous ex-boyfriend that had called the tip line claiming to be John. Although he claimed that she was about to show up at various public locations at various times, the woman never seemed to materialize. Mike also led investigators on a wild goose chase, claiming someone had taken a picture of him outside the temple holding a newspaper on the night of the murders, saying the picture was then buried in the desert. Unsurprisingly, no such photograph was ever found. The following legal process would go on for decades. Alex struck a plea deal in 1993 that shaped the prosecution's case against Johnathan. He agreed to plead guilty to 9 counts of first-degree murder with a sentence of 271 years in prison in exchange for testifying against his friend. The terms of that deal also included that he disclose any other crimes that he had been involved with. If he didn't and he was found to be lying, the deal would be voided. That's when Alex came clean about the murder of Alice Cameron, though it shouldn't come as a surprise that he said that it was his girlfriend Michelle who actually had pulled the trigger. Seems like a pattern. In an effort to secure Alex's testimony, the prosecutor included that murder in the deal. Kind of a kill 9, get 1 free deal, I guess. Johnathan's first trial was fairly straightforward. His recorded confession along with Alex's testimony resulted in him being found guilty on 9 counts of first-degree murder, multiple armed robbery charges, and burglary counts in 1994. He was sentenced to 281 years in prison, but it would not be his last time in court. After his attorney filed an appeal on grounds of improper interrogation and Miranda warning violations, the 9th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals reviewed the case. The court discovered several serious problems with the interrogation, including a grueling overnight questioning session lasting almost 13 hours. The teen suspect had no sleep, and Miranda warnings stretched across 12 pages of transcript, making them unclear. It was determined that investigators failed to properly get Johnathan's confession, and they overturned his conviction in 2011. That decision required new trials, but more problems emerged. The prosecution's first attempt at retrial hit a roadblock in October of 2013 when the jury couldn't reach a verdict. The third and final trial started in December of 2013, bringing new challenges to the prosecutors. They couldn't use Johnathan's confession anymore, so the case depended mostly on Alex's testimony. Alex took the stand again to explain that Johnathan had masterminded the temple robbery plan. He insisted on leaving no witnesses, and he personally fired the fatal shots. Johnathan's defense team tried to discredit Alex's testimony by claiming he made a plea deal to avoid the death penalty, but it didn't seem to work. The jury spent 5 days deliberating and reached their verdict on January 23, 2014. They found Johnathan Doody guilty on all counts. The judge handed down 9 consecutive life sentences, with each sentence requiring 25 years before parole consideration. Johnathan had already served 22 years, but the consecutive sentences meant he wouldn't be eligible for parole for 175 years. Prosecutors couldn't seek the death penalty because of a 2005 U.S. Supreme Court ruling that banned capital punishment for crimes committed by people under the age of 18. The Temple community felt relieved after the final verdict. Barb Heller, who was friends with the victims and spoke for the Temple, said Temple members were grateful the case had finally ended and that Johnathan would stay in prison. The Tucson 4 case exposed flaws in police questioning methods and sparked major reforms. False confessions from the defendants resulted in substantial financial compensation. Leo Bruce and Marky Nunez each received $1.1 million. Dante Parker and Victor Zarata got $240,000, and Dante's mother received $120,000. Law enforcement agencies responded by creating new questioning guidelines, including strict limits on questioning time, requiring recordings of all sessions, better Miranda rights protocols, more thorough review of confession validity, and advanced training to question young suspects. The case's aftermath brought political change. The Maricopa County Sheriff did not win re-election in 1992, and his opponent won by pledging to rebuild the office's damaged reputation after the failed investigation. Unfortunately, it seems that was one of many campaign promises that would never come true. In 2006, an 18-year-old musician named Ryan Waller and his 21-year-old girlfriend Heather Kwan were shot in a home invasion in Phoenix. Heather didn't survive, but despite being shot in the head, Ryan did. Unfortunately, the head trauma made Ryan unaware of what had happened, and when they were discovered by the police, he was taken into custody and interrogated relentlessly by a detective named Paul Dalton. It's become a more well-known example of the many accounts of unethical interrogation practices carried out by authorities in Phoenix since the Tucson 4. I made a documentary about that story, and there's a link to it in the description. Despite this being a long and complicated story that focuses more on people who did not commit murder, it's still important to remember the 9 victims who lost their lives simply due to greed. What happened to the Tucson 4 and George Peterson shouldn't have happened, but they were lucky enough to get out with their lives, something that two monsters did not offer to a group of peaceful Buddhists when they decided their lives were worth less than a few $1,000s worth of cash and electronics. If you're a fan of true crime, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss an episode. You can also hit like or leave us a comment. You can check out our other show, Somewhere Sinister, on YouTube or anywhere that you listen to podcasts. If you'd like to support the show, check out our merchandise at thisismonsters.com. The link is in the description. Thanks again, and be safe.